The escape vessel trembled as it surged forward, dodging debris from the shattered Trion warship. Explosions bloomed in the void like dying stars, illuminating the battlefield in flashes of orange and blue. Alpha gripped the controls, pushing the ship's engines to their limit. Lyra sat beside him, her fingers dancing across the console as she rerouted power to the shields. "We've got fighters closing in fast," she said, her voice tense but steady. Alpha's gaze flickered to the viewport. The Trion fleet had already begun its counterattack. Sleek, angular interceptors peeled away from the larger warships, their crimson thrusters blazing as they pursued. Plasma fire streaked past, shaking the hull. "We won't last in open space," Lyra warned. "We need to find cover, now." Alpha clenched his jaw. The main Wax fleet was still too far away. If they tried to make a direct run for Wax, they'd be cut down before they got close. They needed another way. He scanned the battlefield, searching for options. Among the wreckage of destroyed Trion and Wax vessels, a derelict Trion battleship loomed ahead, its jagged hull barely intact. "There," Alpha said, adjusting their course. "We use that for cover." Lyra didn't argue. The ship veered toward the wreck, weaving through the debris field as enemy fire intensified. The Trion interceptors pursued relentlessly, their cannons glowing with deadly energy. A warning light flickered on Lyra's screen. "Shields at 30%. Alpha exhaled sharply. They had to lose their pursuers fast. His fingers moved across the controls, adjusting their flight path. As they reached the ruined battleship, he suddenly cut the engines, allowing their ship to drift. The pursuing Trion fighters overshot their trajectory, momentarily losing sight of them. It was the opening Alpha needed. With a sharp thrust, he re-engaged the engines and dove toward the battleship's crumbling hull. Their ship barely squeezed through the jagged remains of a ruptured hangar, scraping against the metal walls before bursting out the other side. The Trion pilots weren't so lucky. Two of them tried to follow but miscalculated. One clipped the wreckage and spiraled out of control, crashing into the twisted remains of a corridor. The second hesitated, giving Alpha and Lyra just enough time to disappear into the wreckage field. Lyra let out a breath. "That bought us time. But not much." Alpha didn't relax. They were still deep in enemy territory, and Wax was still under siege. He set his course toward the distant glow of his homeworld, its energy shields flickering like a dying ember against the overwhelming force of the Trion assault. No matter what, they had to make it back. The battered escape vessel tore through the void, trailing fire and debris in its wake. Inside the cockpit, emergency lights flickered, casting an eerie red glow over Alpha and Lyra as they fought to keep the ship under control. The wreckage of the destroyed Trion warship faded behind them, but there was no time to celebrate. Alpha kept his hands firm on the controls, his mind razor-sharp despite the exhaustion settling into his body. Every instinct screamed that they weren't safe yet. The vast blackness ahead stretched endlessly, but somewhere within it, the Trions would be coming for them. Lyra worked furiously at the console, her fingers flying across the controls. "Engines are overheating. Shields are barely holding. We need to find a safer route home." Her voice was steady, but Alpha caught the tension beneath it. "We don't have time to play it safe," he said, eyes locked on the navigational display. Wax was still distant, and every second wasted was another second lost in the battle for their home. "Find the fastest way." Lyra exhaled sharply, scanning the star charts. "There's an asteroid belt near the Helios Rift. If we cut through it, we'll avoid direct pursuit." She paused, chewing her lip. "But it's unstable. Gravity shifts, collisions, if we make a wrong move, we'll be vaporized." Alpha's gaze didn't waver. "Better than being caught in open space." He set their course. The ship trembled under the strain, but it responded, streaking toward the dense cloud of tumbling rock and ice ahead. A shrill alarm cut through the cockpit. Lyra's eyes darted to the scanner, and her heart clenched. Incoming. 2 Trion war cruisers. Multiple fighter wings. They must have tracked us from the wreckage. Alpha's jaw tightened. They're faster than I thought. The crimson blips on the display multiplied. The Trion ships were closing in fast. They had mere minutes before they were within firing range. Lyra's mind raced. I can divert power from weapons to engines. It'll give us a speed boost, but we'll have no defenses. Alpha nodded without hesitation. Do it. Lyra's hands moved swiftly over the control panel, rerouting what little power remained. The ship lurched as its engines surged to maximum output. The stars blurred outside the viewport as they accelerated, hurtling toward the asteroid belt. A sudden explosion rocked the ship. Sparks erupted from a console behind them. They've locked on. Lyra shouted. Shields at 15%. Alpha adjusted their trajectory, zigzagging through space to throw off enemy targeting systems. But the Trions weren't relenting. Bright streaks of plasma fire seared past their hull, missing by mere meters. They're trying to box us in, Lyra said, her fingers tight on the armrest. If they cut us off before we reach the belt. They won't. Alpha's voice was steel. The asteroid field loomed ahead, a chaotic storm of spinning debris, colliding boulders, and icy fragments drifting through space. It was a death trap for the unskilled, but for Alpha, it was an opportunity. He clenched the controls. Hold on. The ship dove into the asteroid belt, skimming past a massive rock that tumbled dangerously close. The Trion fighters hesitated at the entrance, wary of following too aggressively. Their capital ships slowed, unwilling to risk the unpredictable terrain. Lyra exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. Their fighters are still coming. Alpha focused. The Trion small crafts had superior agility, and in a straight chase, they would overtake them. He needed to turn the battlefield to his advantage. A new idea formed. He glanced at the navigation display, calculating the asteroid rotations. I'm going to use the gravity wells to slingshot us forward. Lyra's eyes widened. That's insane. If we miscalculate. We won't. Alpha guided the ship toward the largest asteroid in their path, letting its gravitational pull seize them. The vessel tilted sharply, the metal groaning under the force. Lyra gritted her teeth, gripping the console for support. Just as they were about to be dragged into a collision, Alpha reignited the thrusters and spun the ship hard to the left. The sudden maneuver sent them rocketing past the asteroid's surface at breakneck speed. Behind them, 2 Trion fighters failed to adjust in time. One clipped a jagged rock, spiraling out of control before erupting in a fiery explosion. The other smashed directly into the asteroid, disappearing in a burst of flames. The remaining pursuers hesitated, their formation breaking. Lyra let out a shaky breath. We lost some of them. Alpha didn't ease up. Not enough. He wove through the debris, dodging ice shards and jagged rocks, every movement precise. The Trion ship still followed, but the field's unpredictability was slowing them. Then, the radar flashed a new warning. Lyra's face paled. The gravitational field ahead, it's shifting. The asteroids are realigning. Alpha glanced at the sensor readout. The belt was moving faster than anticipated, a massive gravitational shift pulling multiple asteroids into a new trajectory. If they didn't escape now, they'd be trapped in an unavoidable collision course. Lyra gritted her teeth. We need a way out, now. Alpha scanned the field ahead. A narrow opening appeared between 2 colossal rocks, but it was closing fast. He had seconds to decide. Without hesitation, he angled the ship toward the gap. Brace yourself. Lyra barely had time to react before Alpha pushed the thrusters to their maximum. The ship rocketed forward. The opening shrank with terrifying speed. A split second later, they shot through. The explosion came right after. The two asteroids collided behind them, obliterating the space they had just occupied. The impact sent shockwaves rippling through the field, knocking the remaining Trion fighters off course. Alpha pulled the ship into open space. Silence settled in the cockpit. Lyra turned to him, chest rising and falling. "I can't believe that worked." Alpha didn't respond. His focus was already on the horizon. Wax was still distant. Still under siege. Lyra followed his gaze. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "We have to get back before it's too late." Alpha nodded. No matter what it took, they had to make it home. The battered escape vessel hurtled through space, finally breaking free of the asteroid field. Alpha and Lyra sat in tense silence, watching the scanners. The Trion fighters that had survived the field weren't following, not yet. The chaotic debris had bought them a moment of breathing room, but it wouldn't last. Alpha adjusted the ship's course toward Wax, his hands steady on the controls despite the lingering adrenaline in his veins. The stars blurred past, but the ominous red glow on the long-range scanner sent a chill through him. Lyra's voice was tight. "Look at this." She tapped the console, enlarging the display. The Wax homeworld filled the screen, a radiant blue sphere, but its atmosphere was marred by fire. The planetary energy shield, once a shimmering veil of protection, flickered violently, struggling to hold against the relentless Trion assault. The Trion fleet had doubled in size since they had left. Warships formed an unbreakable blockade, and the Wax defensive forces were in retreat, outgunned and overwhelmed. Alpha exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening. They didn't waste any time. Lyra clenched her fists. "They're using the destabilization weapon." Her voice was laced with urgency. "If they keep this up, Wax won't survive another cycle." The weapon, a monstrous Trion device designed to disrupt planetary energy fields, was already taking its toll. It sent pulses through the planet's core, creating violent earthquakes and destabilizing the energy grid that powered the Wax civilization. If left unchecked, Wax would tear itself apart from the inside. Lyra gritted her teeth. "We have to land. We need to warn the Council about what we found on the Trion warship." Alpha's eyes darkened. "The Trions won't let us through that blockade. Not in this ship." The vessel they had stolen was barely holding together. One direct hit from a Trion cruiser, and they would be reduced to dust. Lyra's fingers danced over the controls, analyzing the enemy fleet. There has to be a way past them. Alpha considered their options. The Wax fleet was losing ground, but there were still pockets of resistance, fractured groups of ships locked in desperate combat against the Trion armada. If they timed it right, they could slip through unnoticed. "We need a distraction," Alpha said, his mind racing through possibilities. "Something big enough to draw their attention away from us." Lyra's eyes flickered with understanding. "The wreckage from the destroyed warship. There's still debris floating in the asteroid field. If we trigger a chain reaction, it could force the Trions to reposition their forces," Alpha finished. He was already adjusting their trajectory. "Enough of a gap for us to get through." Lyra worked quickly, configuring the ship's external systems. "I can remotely detonate one of the larger wrecks. If the explosion's strong enough, the Trions will think it's an attack and divert resources." Alpha nodded. "Do it." Lyra activated the command. A pulse signal transmitted through space, reaching the scattered debris field they had left behind. A few agonizing seconds passed, then the scanners lit up as a series of explosions ignited within the wreckage. The reaction was immediate. The Trion fleet detected the disturbance, and within moments, several warships altered course to investigate. Their formation shifted just enough to create an opening. Alpha seized the moment. Now. The ship accelerated, racing toward the planet. The gap in the Trion defenses wouldn't last long. Lyra kept her eyes on the scanners, her voice low. Hold steady, almost there. A warning alarm blared. They've spotted us, Alpha muttered. A Trion cruiser loomed ahead, its weapons charging. Energy cannons glowed ominously, locking onto their ship. Alpha's grip tightened on the controls. Hang on. The ship spiraled into a rapid descent, plunging through the outer atmosphere of Wax as enemy fire rained down around them. Plasma beams sizzled past their hull, missing by inches. The heat shields flared, the ship rattling violently as it tore through the sky. The familiar silhouette of the Wax capital city came into view, but it was barely recognizable. Fires raged, and entire sectors had been reduced to rubble. The once pristine crystalline structures of the Wax civilization were now broken remnants of war. Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper. It's worse than we thought. Their ship, damaged and barely holding together, streaked toward the ground. Alpha fought the controls, stabilizing the descent as best he could. The landscape rushed toward them at terrifying speed. Brace for impact. The ship smashed into the outskirts of the capital, skidding across the terrain in a violent crash landing. Metal groaned, sparks flew, and the world spun in a blur of chaos. Then, silence. Smoke curled from the wreckage. Alpha's head throbbed, but he forced himself to move. Lyra coughed, pushing herself up from the wreckage beside him. The crash left a deep scar in the crystalline landscape of Wax, smoke curling from the shattered remains of the stolen vessel. Sparks flickered from broken consoles, and the faint hum of dying energy cells pulsed through the wreckage. Alpha forced himself to his feet, shaking off the impact's disorientation. His body ached from the strain, but he had no time to dwell on it. Lyra was already moving, checking the status of their weapons and any remaining supplies. Outside, the sky burned. Wax's energy shield flickered weakly, barely holding back the relentless Trion bombardment. The cityscape, once a masterpiece of crystalline harmony, had become a battlefield. Lyra wiped soot from her face, her voice tense. We need to reach the council chamber. Alpha scanned the horizon. If it still stands. In the distance, towering crystalline spires, the heart of the Wax government, were partially collapsed, the once radiant structures dimmed and cracked. Fires raged across the city, and the air carried the scent of scorched minerals and destruction. Suddenly, movement caught Alpha's eye. Figures in the distance, Wax warriors, battle-worn and outnumbered, locked in a desperate struggle against advancing Trion forces. A squad of Trions, heavily armed and relentless, pushed toward a group of Wax defenders who had formed a last stand near the ruins of a transit hub. The defenders were skilled, manipulating energy into shields and counterattacks, but they were losing ground. Alpha's decision was immediate. We help them. Lyra was already moving, drawing out a compact energy blade. Let's go. The two sprinted toward the battle. Alpha extended his hands, drawing energy from the air around him, molding it into a pulsating sphere of raw power. With a sharp thrust, he released it, a shockwave slammed into the nearest Trions, knocking them off their feet. Lyra moved with precision, her energy blade cutting through Trion armor, striking with speed and control. The Wax warriors, realizing the reinforcements, rallied. Their once fading energy flared back to life. A Trion captain, towering over the others, stepped forward. His armor pulsed with a dark, unnatural energy, a prototype shielding system that absorbed Wax energy attacks. He raised a massive plasma weapon, locking onto Alpha. Alpha barely dodged the blast as it scorched the ground where he had stood. Lyra leaped forward, striking at the captain's armor, but her energy blade barely left a mark. This one's different, she warned, eyes narrowing. Alpha clenched his fists, recalculating. He couldn't overpower the shield, but he could disrupt it. The crash left a deep scar in the crystalline landscape of Wax, smoke curling from the shattered remains of the stolen vessel. Sparks flickered from broken consoles, and the faint hum of dying energy cells pulsed through the wreckage. Alpha forced himself to his feet, shaking off the impact's disorientation. His body ached from the strain, but he had no time to dwell on it. Lyra was already moving, checking the status of their weapons and any remaining supplies. Outside, the sky burned. Wax's energy shield flickered weakly, barely holding back the relentless Trion bombardment. The cityscape, once a masterpiece of crystalline harmony, had become a battlefield. Lyra wiped soot from her face, her voice tense. "We need to reach the council chamber." Alpha scanned the horizon. If it still stands. In the distance, towering crystalline spires, the heart of the Wax government, were partially collapsed, the once radiant structures dimmed and cracked. Fires raged across the city, and the air carried the scent of scorched minerals and destruction. Suddenly, movement caught Alpha's eye. Figures in the distance, Wax warriors, battle-worn and outnumbered, locked in a desperate struggle against advancing Trion forces. A squad of Trions, heavily armed and relentless, pushed toward a group of Wax defenders who had formed a last stand near the ruins of a transit hub. The defenders were skilled, manipulating energy into shields and counterattacks, but they were losing ground. Alpha's decision was immediate. "We help them." Lyra was already moving, drawing out a compact energy blade. "Let's go." The two sprinted toward the battle. Alpha extended his hands, drawing energy from the air around him, molding it into a pulsating sphere of raw power. With a sharp thrust, he released it, a shockwave slammed into the nearest Trions, knocking them off their feet. Lyra moved with precision, her energy blade cutting through Trion armor, striking with speed and control. The Wax warriors, realizing the reinforcements, rallied. Their once fading energy flared back to life. A Trion captain, towering over the others, stepped forward. His armor pulsed with a dark, unnatural energy, a prototype shielding system that absorbed Wax energy attacks. He raised a massive plasma weapon, locking onto Alpha. Alpha barely dodged the blast as it scorched the ground where he had stood. Lyra leaped forward, striking at the captain's armor, but her energy blade barely left a mark. "This one's different," she warned, eyes narrowing. Alpha clenched his fists, recalculating. He couldn't overpower the shield, but he could disrupt it. Alpha tensed. This wasn't an ordinary soldier, this was Commander Vorik, a name spoken with dread among the Wax. He had led the first assault, the one that had shattered their defenses and left Wax vulnerable. Vorik's helmet retracted, revealing his scarred face and cold, predatory eyes. "You escaped once. This time, you die here." Alpha said nothing. Words would not change what was about to happen. With a roar, Vorik lunged forward, swinging a plasma-forged warblade that cut through the air like a comet. Alpha dodged, barely avoiding the strike as the blade sliced through a fallen crystal column, turning it to molten debris. Lyra leapt forward, striking with her energy blade, but Vorik was faster than expected. He twisted, blocking her attack with his gauntlet before countering with a vicious backhand that sent her sprawling. Alpha moved on instinct. His hands surged with raw energy as he unleashed a focused blast toward Vorik's chest. The Trion commander absorbed the hit, skidding backward but remaining upright. His armor pulsed, dispersing the energy like a living shield. "Your power is nothing," Vorik sneered. "The Trions have adapted." Alpha narrowed his eyes. This wasn't just armor, it was a refined version of the energy absorption technology they had encountered before. Vorik's suit fed off Wax energy attacks, converting them into power. Direct attacks wouldn't work. They had to be smarter. Lyra, recovering from the hit, gritted her teeth. "We need another way." Alpha analyzed the battlefield. They were outnumbered, facing an enemy that had specifically adapted to counter them. But he had one advantage, Vorik's arrogance. The Trion commander relished the fight, wanted to prove his dominance. That would be his weakness. Alpha stepped forward, lowering his stance. "Then come and take my life, Vorik." The challenge was clear. The Trion commander's lips curled into a cruel grin. With pleasure. Vorik charged, blade raised. But Alpha was ready. As the blade descended, Alpha twisted his energy, not into a shield, not into an attack, but into a redirection. Instead of absorbing the impact, he flowed with it, shifting his energy field to disrupt Vorik's armor instead of fueling it. The moment the warblade connected, a backlash of unstable energy surged through Vorik's suit. The once protective armor crackled, struggling to contain the sudden feedback. Lyra saw the opening and moved. Fast. She struck, her blade slipping through the weakened armor, cutting deep. Vorik staggered, roaring in fury as his systems failed, sparks flying from his exosuit. The other Trion warriors hesitated. Their commander was falling. Alpha didn't wait. Now. The Wax warriors surged forward, striking with precision. The battlefield shifted in an instant. Trions who had been confident moments ago now found themselves losing ground. Vorik stumbled, his breathing ragged. His armor, once a symbol of invincibility, had become his weakness. His eyes locked onto Alpha, rage and disbelief burning within them. "This is not over," he snarled. Then, with a final growl, he triggered his emergency teleportation, vanishing in a burst of light. The battle was won, but only barely. Lyra exhaled, lowering her weapon. That was too close. Alpha turned toward the ruined council chamber. It's not over yet. They had fought their way here, but what would they find inside? The fate of Wax's leaders, and their entire civilization, now rested behind those shattered doors. The heavy doors of the council chamber stood ahead, cracked and barely holding together. Smoke curled from the edges where Trion weapons had blasted through, leaving the once pristine entrance scarred and broken. Alpha placed a hand against the door, feeling the lingering traces of energy within the structure. It had once been a place of wisdom, where decisions were made for the betterment of Wax. Now, it was a battlefield. Lyra stepped beside him, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Do you think anyone is still alive in there?" Alpha didn't answer. Instead, he pushed against the doors, and with a low groan, they gave way. The chamber inside was barely recognizable. The great crystal columns had shattered, their remains littering the floor. The intricate energy conduits that once ran through the walls flickered weakly, their glow fading. In the center of the chamber, a group of Wax Council members huddled behind a collapsed structure, their robes torn and faces marked with exhaustion. Relief washed over Alpha as he recognized Elder Ch.11 among them. The old counselor's sharp eyes met his, filled with both surprise and determination. He was alive, but barely. The others looked weakened, their energy reserves nearly depleted. Elder Ch.11 took a step forward, gripping Alpha's arm. "You returned." His voice was hoarse, but steady. "We feared the worst." Alpha glanced around. "Where are the others?" Ch.11's expression darkened. "Taken. The Trions captured as many as they could before we barricaded ourselves here. Those who resisted were," his voice trailed off. The meaning was clear. A deep tremor shook the chamber, and dust rained from above. The distant roar of battle continued outside. Lyra turned toward the doorway, her instincts on high alert. "We don't have much time. The Trions will be back soon." Alpha turned back to Ch.11. "We have to move. The city is falling, and Wax won't hold much longer." One of the younger council members, barely past his initiation, looked up with desperation in his eyes. "Then where do we go? The Trions are everywhere. There's no escape." Alpha met his gaze. "There is always an escape. But we have to act now." Ch.11 nodded, though his face was etched with the weight of everything they had lost. "Lead the way." Alpha and Lyra helped the weakened council members to their feet. They were drained, their energy reserves nearly gone from sustaining the city's last defenses. Without them, the remaining Wax forces would lose all coordination. The group moved quickly, navigating through the broken chamber and into the tunnels beneath. These ancient passages had once been used only in times of great crisis. Now, they were the only path to survival. As they pressed forward, Lyra glanced at Alpha. "This isn't just a retreat, is it?" Alpha didn't look at her, but his silence was enough of an answer. The tunnels trembled with the aftershocks of distant explosions, the once sacred underground sanctuary now little more than a crumbling refuge. The Wax survivors moved quickly through the passageways, their glowing eyes darting between the unstable walls and the faint flickers of energy radiating from the surface above. Alpha led the way, scanning ahead with sharpened focus. Every step felt heavier, the weight of leadership pressing down on him with relentless force. His people had lost too much already, and the battle was far from over. Behind him, Lyra kept pace, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion gnawing at her. She was quieter now, lost in thought, but Alpha could feel her presence like an unspoken promise. She would not falter, not now. A sudden tremor shook the ground beneath them. Dust rained from the ceiling, and a deep crack split through the crystalline walls. Elder Shaun stumbled, barely catching himself before Alpha reached out to steady him. "We're running out of time," Lyra murmured, eyes scanning the dimly lit path ahead. Alpha knew she was right. The Trions were closing in, and soon, there would be no escape left. Then, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnels. Alpha froze, signaling for silence. The Wax warriors gripped their energy blades, every muscle tensed as the unmistakable hum of Trion armor filled the air. They had been found. A blinding flash of red light sliced through the darkness as the first Trion soldier stepped into view. His armor gleamed under the faint energy glow of the cavern, and his weapon crackled with raw power. More figures followed, their presence suffocating the narrow space. Alpha's mind raced. They couldn't afford a full battle in these tunnels. One wrong strike, and the whole structure could collapse. Lyra met his gaze, already knowing what he was thinking. "We need to break through. Fast." Alpha tightened his grip on his weapon, his energy pulsing through his body like a second heartbeat. "Then we don't give them time to react." With a sharp exhale, he moved first. His blade ignited in a brilliant arc, cutting through the nearest Trion before the enemy even had a chance to fire. Lyra followed an instant later, her energy rippling outward in a controlled burst that sent two soldiers crashing into the walls. The tunnel erupted into chaos. Blades clashed, energy blasts ricocheted against the crystal structures, and the narrow space became a suffocating battlefield. The Wax fought with desperate precision, but the Trions had the advantage of numbers and firepower. A sudden blast sent Alpha stumbling backward, his vision flickering with white-hot pain. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked from his lungs. Above him, a Trion warrior loomed, weapon raised for the final strike. Before Alpha could react, Lyra was there. She moved like lightning, her blade slicing through the enemy in a single, fluid motion. The Trion collapsed before he could fire. Lyra knelt beside Alpha, her breath ragged. "You're not allowed to die yet." Alpha managed a smirk, despite the pain. "I wasn't planning on it." She pulled him to his feet just as another explosion roared through the tunnels. The walls groaned under the strain, and deep cracks spread like veins through the crystalline structures. Shaun called out, urgency in his voice. "The tunnels won't hold much longer." Alpha turned to the group. "Everyone, move. We have to get out before this whole place comes down." With no time to waste, they ran. The battle was far from over, and the hardest decisions were yet to come. The tunnels shook violently as the battle raged above, each impact sending fresh cracks splintering through the crystalline walls. The Wax warriors pushed forward, desperate to reach the surface before their only escape route collapsed around them. Alpha could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. The Trions were relentless, their war machines tearing through Wax's defenses, their soldiers advancing with merciless precision. If the Wax didn't act now, they would be overrun. As they neared the tunnel's exit, a deep, thunderous sound echoed through the cavern. A massive explosion tore through the chamber behind them, sealing off the path they had just crossed. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a brief moment, silence followed. Then came the voices. Trion forces had discovered them. A column of enemy soldiers emerged from the shadows, their energy weapons humming with lethal intensity. Alpha raised his blade, ready for the inevitable clash, but before the first strike landed, Lyra placed a hand on his arm. "There's another way," she whispered. Alpha's gaze met hers, searching for meaning in her words. Then he understood. The Nexus core. It was dangerous, unstable, but if there was ever a time to use it, it was now. Lyra stepped forward, her hands glowing with raw energy. "Get them out of here," she said, her voice calm despite the storm raging around them. Alpha hesitated. "Lyra." She turned to him, her expression resolute. "Trust me." For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The sounds of battle faded, and all Alpha could see was her, standing there, unwavering, her eyes filled with something more powerful than war, more unbreakable than the enemy closing in around them. A silent promise passed between them. Then Lyra unleashed the Nexus core's energy. A blinding wave of power erupted from her, surging outward in a pulse that sent the Trions reeling. The cavern trembled under the force, the walls cracking, the ceiling beginning to give way. Alpha had no choice. "Move," he commanded, leading the others toward the surface as the tunnels collapsed behind them. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed the cavern was Lyra, standing amidst the energy storm, holding back the enemy with everything she had. The Wax warriors emerged into the open air just as the underground chambers caved in. The sky above them burned with the fires of war, Trion ships blotting out the stars, their planetary destabilization weapon wreaking havoc on the surface. Alpha's heart pounded as he turned back toward the ruins of the tunnel. Then, through the swirling dust and debris, a figure emerged. Lyra. She was exhausted, her steps unsteady, but she was alive. Alpha rushed to her, catching her just before she collapsed. She looked up at him with a weak smile. "Told you. I wasn't going anywhere." He held her close, the battle momentarily fading around them. But only for a moment. Because in the distance, the Trion mothership loomed, its weapons charging for one final, devastating strike. The Wax warriors emerged into the open air just as the underground chambers caved in. The sky above them burned with the fires of war, Trion ships blotting out the stars, their planetary destabilization weapon wreaking havoc on the surface. Alpha turned back toward the ruins of the tunnel, his chest tight with uncertainty. Then, through the swirling dust and debris, a figure appeared. Lyra. She was exhausted, her steps unsteady, but she was alive. Alpha rushed to her, catching her just before she collapsed. She looked up at him with a weak smile. "Told you. I wasn't going anywhere." He held her close, allowing himself the briefest moment of relief. But in the distance, the Trion mothership loomed, its weapons charging for another devastating assault. The battle was far from over, and they had little time to regroup. Alpha lifted his gaze to the sky, his mind already racing through their next move. They had survived this fight, but survival wasn't enough. It was time to turn the tide.